I was out camping with some friends just a couple of months ago, and I had an extremely bizarre and somewhat terrifying encounter that I cannot explain. We decided to go and camp near Bullfrog Marina, Lake Powell, Utah, and since the primitive campground was closed due to COVID, we decided to find a camp spot on a nearby road. We spent the first night in an hallucinogenic-fueled state, with the full moon shining above us. It was truly an amazing spiritual experience. The next day, we went down to the beach at Bullfrog Marina and spent the day in the sun, and when we got back to the camp, most of my friends decided to take a nap. My brother and I knew that if we took a nap, that we may as well call it a night. So, we chose to go explore the gully and the dry riverbed below our camp. It was beautiful, a very beautiful area. We actually found a bullfrog hopping around and what we determined to be lemur footprints. It was after dusk at this point and was starting to get pretty dark. I told my brother that I wanted to check out this little canyon near the riverbed before we went back to camp. He agreed, so we made our way into the canyon. It was actually pretty dark in the canyon, and I only had a small flashlight with me. I was walking in front, and my brother behind me. I figured that it was a fairly small canyon, and I assumed that the rock wall that I was looking at near the back of the canyon was the end. But as I thought we were nearing the end, I noticed that the canyon actually curved back more to the right. As I saw that it went back further than I speculated, I remembered that it is not uncommon for there to be bobcats and cougars in this area. I started feeling a little uneasy at the thought of it being a potential den for a predator, when a breeze blew into the canyon and a bush near me moved as a result of the wind. "Oh shit," I said, and my brother responded with, "What?" Seeing that I was startled. "Oh, it was just a bush," I replied, as I made my way around the bush and peered in the back of the canyon. I saw something walking toward me at a fairly fast pace. "Oh my, go!" I hollered at my brother, and we ran back up the embankment in the canyon to higher ground. What did you see?" he asked me, as I was shining my light down near the bush that I was near earlier. "I saw something darting toward me." "That was terrifying," I replied. "What did it look like?" he asked. "It looked humanoid, bony, and standing on two legs," I said. He felt uneasy too at this point. "I couldn't see too well. It is so dark in here. Maybe it was my imagine..." Right as I said that, my light shined down on two eyes behind the bush, swaying as if it was trying to get a better look at us through the bush. "We need to go," I yelled, and we took off out of the canyon. We made it back to the riverbed and paused for a moment. I looked back to see if whatever I saw was following us. We saw nothing at this point, and we kept moving back toward our camp. Part of me wanted to go back for a better look, because I've always wanted to experience something supernatural, if that is what this was. But the other part of me wanted to get out of there. Eventually, we made it back to the camp, and our friends were still sleeping. We ate a little food, and once we winded down a little bit, we decided it was best to go to bed. When we woke up the next day, as we're getting ready to head home, I told my friends what had happened, and they were freaked out hearing my story. One of my friends told me that he woke up to the sounds of somebody walking around his tent in the middle of the night. He said he thought it was one of us, but hearing that made him think it could have been someone or something else. I still do not know what I saw that night, but the thought of it still frightens me to this day. Most of my family lives out on the reservation, but I moved states away many years ago to get out of that hellhole. I've since started a new job and a new life in other places. I much prefer the greenery of southern Oregon than I do the deserts of New Mexico and Arizona. I still make trips back to see my family every so often, and unfortunately, as much as I don't want to believe it to be true, we do have our encounters with dark spirits. Just this last time I was there, my brother believes he was followed home by what he believes what you would call a skinwalker. We have a name for them, and our culture does, but I'm not going to mention it because I don't want to bring attention to it. He was coming back from a friend's house, and he said he made eye contact with this strange-looking person covered in animal skins walking alongside the road in the middle of the night. It wasn't pitch black yet, but it was dusk, bright enough to where he could still see the person's face. He drove by, and they made complete eye contact, and he told me he felt like this person attached itself to him. I blew him off and didn't really know what he meant. I thought he was just huffing and puffing. He said he could feel this person's energy attached to him and his vehicle, and then the person started sprinting after his truck. He only drove faster, but then when he looked back up in his rearview mirror, the person was gone. He kept driving, but then only a few minutes later, noticed this abnormally large coyote running alongside his truck about 100 feet or so out in the desert, staying parallel with him. It looked very mangy and had very unnatural sunken-in eyes. He just got bad feelings from this thing and decided to lead it astray instead of leading it directly back to the house. He pulled through some different areas and neighborhoods and took a very long way home. He lost track of it at some point, but he's still sure that it's watching him somewhere. Sometimes he used to always think the whole skinwalker jargon was just a bunch of crap, but the more time I spent with my family out here, the more I realized there is a lot more truth to it than I would like to accept. You can be even trying your best to stay out of it, but that still doesn't guarantee you safety. Luckily, we have medicine men in our family who can pray and protect over us, but these things still, I feel like they have too much power. I don't feel like medicine men is enough to protect us. This is one of the reasons that I feel so much safer having moved to Oregon and far away. I know Southern Oregon isn't exactly a safe zone per se, but much better than being at ground zero, where these things thrive and feed off the torment of the weak. I know for a fact that skinwalkers are real, or if they are not skinwalkers, they are something. A month ago, in June, I was driving through the reservation with a friend of mine when we stopped to pull over to go pee outside. I decided to have a quick cigarette real quick, while my friend had to drain the pipes. We felt a weird energy as soon as we got out of the car. There were no other cars around in the visible vicinity. Out here, you can see other cars coming for a long ways away, just because of how flat it is. We did, however, have a wonderful view of the mesas and the red desert that spanned forever. We're not from around the Navajo reservation, but we've had many friends from the area, so we're familiar with the terrain. As I was saying, the energy, it felt very off. My friend's pissing in the one sagebush, and I'm puffing away on my cigarette, when off in the desert, we see this tall, skinny black figure with what looks to be a skull-type head stand up from behind a large bush and begin walking towards us slowly. I start saying to my friend, "Do you see what I'm seeing?" And I kid you not, midstream, he starts freaking out and pointing, saying, "What is that thing? Why is it coming towards us? We need to get out of here." The best I can describe to you is the body reminded me something like Slender Man or something. Very tall, very lanky, but obviously not 13 feet tall or anything creepypasta or unrealistic looking. Probably more 7 to 8 feet tall, if I had to guess. Not too much taller than I. It reminded me whatever it was in was long tattered black robes or something. They were very dirty. Again, it was very slender. The head looked to be that of a goat skull or something weird. It was a skull though, I can tell you that. And from the distance it was away from us, it was as clear as day that it was a skull that had some sort of horns on it, like possibly a goat skull, and it was walking on 2 legs toward us, very slowly, never breaking stride or eye contact. Although, even the way it moved seemed incredibly weird. It didn't bob up and down like a person normally does when they take a stride. It kind of glided. Even though there were points where there should have been visible legs, it was just a long black tattered robe from what I can tell, and it stayed unmoving. But again, it was very slow and steadily moving towards us. Who knows why or what it was? Since my friend and I are familiar with the area, we've had friends who are native to these parts and have their own stories to tell. Stories that I've always written off, but I've had some stories from friends that were terrifying in a way. Part of the reason I've always wanted to avoid coming to the reservation, even though in my own mind I wanted to deny it as much as I possibly could. I guess the question I should be asking is, were we targeted for a reason? Could it have just been a mere coincidence that we were at the wrong place at the wrong time? My friend and I jumped back into the car and got out of there. I don't recall ever being so afraid in my life, and I'm not one to buy into the whole creepypasta BS. I would like to think that it was somebody in a costume trying to spook us, but who would be out there in the middle of the desert on a 110-degree day in full costume? It doesn't make any sense. We were only out there for maybe 2 minutes, if even that, before we saw this thing. We were laughing and joking, making noise, but I didn't think we were that loud. But I'm guessing that maybe this thing had heard us. This happened when I was just 12 years old, and might take a little backstory for it to make sense. So, at the time, I was a young girl about to start high school. Now, I had some anxiety from the stress of changing schools and some family trouble, which didn't make things any easier for me. So, my mother is from Nova Scotia, and my father is from Europe. We were staying in a cabin in Nova Scotia. I won't say exactly where, but it was a place where we stayed almost every summer, so I was used to sleeping there. The cabin is located on the water, with another property on one side and a patch of forest on the other. This happened one day in August, but I can't seem to remember the exact date. At the time, my father was away for the night to visit a friend, so it was just me, my twin sister, who we'll just call Annabelle, my little brother, we'll call him Thomas, and my mother Amanda, of course, not their real names. So, I was listening to something on my iPad, I don't remember what, and looking out to the window at the forest. For the longest time, it was just forest, nothing for me to be alarmed about. But after an hour or so, I saw something in the woods. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of car headlights on the leaves, but when I kept looking at it, I realized that they were eyes. 2 large, gray, oval-shaped eyes. I didn't know what to do at first. I was paralyzed. I slowly walked away from the window, and the eyes shifted their gaze as whatever it was disappeared into the woods. I was shaken, but decided not to tell anyone, and tried to rationalize it as just being a reflection, as I had thought before. I didn't see anything else for the rest of the night, but the next morning is when I got a really good scare. I was sleeping in a room with my brother and my mother, while my sister slept down the hall. It was very hot, so I was having trouble sleeping. At around 4 o'clock in the morning, I had a dream. It was one of those dreams where you're just running, but you don't really know why, except this time, I did know what I was running from. I didn't even need to look back to know what I was running from. It was the creature from the woods, and it was chasing me on all fours from the sound of it. The dream only lasted a few seconds, but the worst part was when I woke up. My heart was beating faster than it ever had before, and I couldn't open my eyes, no matter how hard I tried. I felt as though something was holding them closed. All I could hear was my heart beating, but I could also hear this other sound. It sounded like heavy, raspy breath, mixed with shrill screaming. After about 15 seconds, that felt like 15 minutes, I could open my eyes again, but I almost wish I hadn't. When I opened my eyes, I saw a tall, 7-foot-tall creature slowly going out the door of the room. The creature's skin was a light gray, and looked not scaly, but almost like that of a frog. Its mouth stretched across its face, and when it opened its mouth, it opened much wider than any human could. It didn't look at me as it walked out of the room. and I just stared at it as it walked down the stairs and right through the locked front door. I didn't sleep much after that, and in the morning, I decided not to tell my family about it, since they did not see or hear the creature, and I did not want them to think I was insane. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but this was not the last time I saw that creature. Later that summer, we were back in our apartment. Now, our apartment looks over a street with 6 lanes, so there's almost always at least one car on that stretch of road, even late at night. So the night this took place, it was around 11 o'clock at night, and I was the only one in our living room. I was going to go to bed when I noticed something unusual outside my window. The street outside was completely empty, not even a parked car, but what I did see still makes me shudder whenever I think about it. The creature from the cabin was slowly walking down the road. At first, it just walked down the road. Then it stopped. Slowly, and to my horror, it turned its head up to make eye contact with me. Our apartment building has many levels, and it was at least 60 feet from our building. It met my eyes exactly. This lasted for about 5 seconds. Then, it looked away, and I ran to my bed as fast as I could. To this day, I still do not know what I saw those 2 nights, and if anybody has any idea what I saw, please let me know. I haven't seen this creature since, and I hope I never see anything like that again. Growing up, my life wasn't always easy. I've had a lot of strange things happen to me on my time growing up around my parents' house and my grandfather's farm. I would go and spend the summer at my grandparents' most years just to get away from my toxic home environment, due to my parents' constant fighting. It was never stable, but it was at my grandparents' house that things went to a whole different level of uncomfortable. My grandparents were sweet and loving people, and that was never a problem. They loved us more than their own children, it seemed. But I can't help but shake the feeling that every time I played outside as a kid, I was always being watched, very closely. There were times at night when you could get this weird feeling in the air, like static electricity or something. Sometimes I would be awakened in the middle of the night by a loud metallic banging, or what sounded like that, far off in the woods. Looking out the window, sometimes at night, you could see a strange blue, red, and green lights glowing and fading, then glowing and fading. I guess pulsating would be the right word. Sometimes I would catch dark figures darting throughout the trees just beyond where I was playing, and I always just thought it was animals. But as I got older, I became all the more wiser. Besides, all of that strange phenomenon, there's just one account that really stands out to me as terribly freaky and puts me on the edge to this day. Speaking of edge, on the very edge of my grandparents' farm, they had this really large storm drain. It was one of those storm drains that were big enough that you could walk in and stand up in, and then that went underneath another concrete platform that my grandfather had. Listen, it's difficult to explain, but it led off into the small pond, and that small pond, in turn, turned into a tiny creek, and then that went into the woods. When I was probably about 11 or 12, I was playing by this small pond, and I started hearing noise within the large storm drain, the same storm drain that I would play in sometimes. The noise made its way closer and closer to where I was playing, and at first, I thought maybe it was my grandfather who was in there doing something, but it sounded much heavier. I could begin to hear the raspy, heavy, withered breathing. Then, I began to feel the air around me change, and I felt imminent danger. I started to back off and run, and I hid behind a nearby tree. I peeked my head out, and not even 5 seconds later, this monstrosity crawls out of the drain pipe and plops down into the small pond, then climbs out and wanders off into the woods as if nothing ever happened, not even looking around to check its surroundings. It was tall, a very purple, humanoid-looking creature, very gangly, and had long appendages dangling from its back and arms. Its head was pointed and had a very stretched face, if that makes any sense. like if somebody were to grab somebody's face from behind and pull it back. Like Botox, I guess. Looking back now, it kind of reminded me of a cross between an alien, like a Grey, a creature from Tim Burton's Nightmares, and a Pirates of the Caribbean creature, like one of the underwater Davy Jones creatures. I feel like that would be the best way to sum it up, but it was sure as hell freaky looking, and scared me so bad that I ran back to my grandfather crying, who tried to comfort me and reassure me that there was nothing over there. The thing even walked funny, like it was drunk, or kind of staggered just like how a zombie does. I had nightmares about that moment for a long time now, and I could remember vividly what it looks like. Maybe I should sit down sometime and draw it out so I can send it to you so you could share it with everybody. That was the only time I've ever seen something like that. I continued to stay there and visit as my life went on, and the strange sounds, the strange lights, and the feelings, all of that continued, but I never had a sighting of that thing again. I never played by the pond or the storm drain after that either, so I guess I can never be fully too sure that it didn't come back to pay a visit. To begin this tale, there are a few things you should know. This happened during my first semester of my sophomore year in college. It was winter at this time, so snow was everywhere, and the moon was usually blacked out by clouds. I lived and went to college in the Black Hills. For those of you who don't know, it's a giant national forest made up of dense pine trees. It also overlaps the Native American reservation land and was the site of many confrontations during the Indian relocation, which is important to remember. Finally, like many college students, I like to let loose and have a little bit of fun every now and then. On this particular night, my friends and I thought it would be chill to drive through a nearby scenic canyon just right outside of town, smoke a bit of pot, and look at the stars. We accomplished the first two tasks, the second of which was done with great enthusiasm. But it was hard to look at the stars because clouds were drifting across the sky and blocking up most of it. This is where the story actually takes off. There were 5 of us in total that night. I and one other friend just wanted to head back to campus and maybe play some video games, chill for the rest of the night. The other 3 thought it would be a great idea to find a random trail and take a night hike through the forest. Since majority rules, we went with that option and found a pretty secluded area with several trails rounding through dense parts of the forest. We all got out, grabbed some blankets from the trunk to wrap around ourselves because it was just so dang cold, picked a trail at random, and started off. Now, to tell you the truth, I'm a pretty jumpy individual that gets spooked easily. Compound that with my heavy anxiety, darkness, and weed, and you have one scared girl that just wants to go home. I did not say anything to my friends, however, because they were having a good time, and I didn't want to be a Debbie Downer and ruin it. We had been on the trail for about 20 minutes and had been using the lights on our phones because, again, the night sky was obscured and obstructed by clouds. The trail wasn't even halfway done at this point. My friend at the front of the group stopped suddenly and flashed her phone up to the trees on the one side of the trail in front of us a few yards. She said, "Did you guys see that?" We all copied her and flashed our phones up there. At first, I thought she was just hallucinating from the weed, but then a shape started to take form. My initial reaction was that it was a bobcat, since it was lower to the ground than a mountain lion and seemed to be crouching. One friend shouted, "Oh crap, it's a deer. I was scared for a second." Another said, "No, it's a rabbit." No one seemed to be able to pinpoint what it was or what size it should be. As we were arguing what it was, it turned its head toward us and its eyes flashed in our phone lights. I gotta tell ya, I've been hunting all my life, have had all types of cats, dogs, cattle, you name it around me as I grew up. This means I have seen quite a few animals and how their eyes shine glow, either from predator or prey. This thing, its eyes were both that of an animal and completely different. that I did not know what on God's green earth it was. It was not human, animal, or anything I had come across before. It chilled me more than the cold of winter ever could. After it turned toward us, my friend had died off in their arguing and had begun what I can only describe as sick, terrifying sort of stare-off between all 5 of us and this creature. Then, it did something that I will never forget for as long as I live. It stood up. I thought it was a bobcat. My friends had thought it was animals of varying size, but nothing extraordinarily large. As it stood, it kept going higher and higher and higher until it reached what I assumed to be at least 7 to 8 feet, if not larger. I assume it was larger because as soon as it hit that mark, my friends and I all started screaming and sprinting back the way we had come. A trail that took us 20 minutes to stumble through in our state took us only 5 when we're running like our lives depended on it. We all dove into the car, the driver floored it, and we sped all the way back to campus. After catching our breaths, we kept asking each other things like, "What was that? Did you see that thing? Was that real?" The night we all recollected what we saw, solidified that it was not just a hallucination, and decided it was some sort of animal, and agreed to move on with our lives. Only, I can't. My friends all told me it was just a bear, to not worry, because we had gotten away. I can't believe it. That thing, from what I had seen of it, what had emaciated and protruding bones under its skin. I couldn't see if it was skin or fur, just its silhouette and shadows around it, and flashes of its build. Also, it was the middle of winter. No bears would be out there, and they also never ventured to this part of the Black Hills. Remember how I mentioned reservation land around the area? Well, even though I myself am not a Native American, I had grown up on a reservation of the Lakota Sioux, the same tribe that inhabit parts of the Black Hills. They have many, many myths and folklore about various creatures that live in the hills. I took it upon myself to think back on some of the legends that I was told growing up, and also asked some of the elders from the tribe that I knew. They gave me some possible answers. I will tell you 2 of them. The first one is an innocent, if not familiar character from the Lakota legends. He is their version of Bigfoot. Lakota tribe members and storytellers debate whether or not this is a singular creature or an entire species, but all the same, it is a mostly harmless being that just wanders the forest and can act as an older brother in native stories. Altogether, it would not have been that terrifying if that was what was on the trail that night. However, I unfortunately have to side with the next creature as being the most probable one we met. There is a malicious spirit in the Lakota myth called Doubleface. He takes the shape of a man, sometimes an animal, sometimes something in between. He is also described as looking like an ogre, but I'd like to keep Shrek out of this. His front face is that of a human, if a bit disfigured. If you see this one, you are fine, but if not, and you stick around, he will try to convince you to take a peek at the face on the back of his head, which, once you look at it, will paralyze you or kill you with a single glare. If it does not kill you, Doubleface will finish the deed by beating you to death or eating you alive. That's a common theme in a lot of native lore: cannibalism. I ruled out Wendigos because if it had been one, I would not be alive to tell this story. You might think it's ridiculous that I am putting so much credence on these supposed myths, but until you have seen what I saw in the dark of the night in the Black Hills, sat at a campfire with elders as they blessed you with sage, and listened as they provided you with both answers and caution moving forward, you will never understand how terrifying it is to realize that not all legends stay in stories. Back in 1992, I was visiting the lovely state of Michigan for a close family friend's wedding. It was summer, and everything is incredibly lush and full of life. The wedding went by, and we got to the best part, the reception, where many drank and partied far into the night. I had struggled with alcohol a lot growing up, so I was one of the only few sober individuals there at the time, besides some other apostolic elders who were pretty anti-alcohol and drinking altogether. People were starting to leave and head home when, clear as day, we all heard the most disturbing, loud howl yell. It was so loud that you could feel the vibrations from it in your chest and ears. It hurt that it was so loud. This got everyone's attention, and we all looked over in the direction that it came from, which was the heavily forested area just beyond the reception area outside. Many started looking panicked and confused, not knowing what the sound was or where exactly it came from. People started whispering and talking in hushed, panicked tones. It didn't quite sound like a human, but had a quality to it that sounded remotely human, just much more visceral. It was like mixing a wolf howl with a person yelling, and making that very guttural. My friend, the groomsman, and his newly bride, the color had drained from their faces completely. I knew then that what we all heard wasn't normal. We weren't crazy. We knew it. There was easily still 60 people minimum at this reception at the time. For those that were drinking, I bet it sobered them up real quick. I still think about this happening, and it gives me the shivers. I've grown up in areas where I've heard wolves howl, and I've heard coyotes plenty of times. This didn't sound like either. Wolves and coyotes don't also have that guttural quality to it, like this did. The volume alone was unnatural, and the size of the animal would have to be immensely large for it to have that kind of volume. I can only imagine the lung size of whatever animal made this howl. I got a really interesting story for you. So interesting that in fact, I honestly thought I was having a joke played on me at the time. This happened back in the early 1980s, when at the time, I was fishing at a secret location on a creek that only I really knew about. This was in northern Michigan, so funny enough at the time, I had just seen the movie American Werewolf in London, like a week or two prior before this happened. This is the major proponent to why I believe, or believed at the time, that I was being pranked. I got to my fishing spot very early, right about sunrise, and spent the better half of the entire day there. It was probably about lunchtime, because I had just gotten done eating a turkey sandwich, and the sun was directly overhead. I noticed some movement coming across the embankment that caught my eye. At first, it was the brush and bushes moving around, but then there became more and more movement. This led me to believe that it was a larger animal, maybe a bear, since I know there are bears up here. I've just never seen one in the flesh. Now I started paying a lot more attention to the movement than I did my line in the water. Then I saw it. 2 long cropped ears. Then the entire head and the upper body popped up out of the brush, looking down to the west at something. I was caught in a state of surprise at what I was looking at. This looked to be somebody in an elaborate werewolf costume. I kind of chuckled to myself, thinking, wow, one of my friends must have gone to great lengths to follow me here secretly, getting into a suit to try and scare me. But there were just some things that didn't fully line up with that way of thinking. This animal was intently looking down at something behind the bushes that I just could not see. Then I saw it crouch down again, with the only tops of its ears poking out. After about a few more minutes, or seconds, I don't remember, it fully stood up, looking still and looking down. Its focus was intent on something. At the time, I don't think I was buying it, and I thought it was still one of my friends, and they were waiting for the perfect opportune moment to try and scare me. So I entirely dropped my rod, stood up, and yelled out to this thing that I thought was my friend at the time, "Hey, asshole!" And as quick as you can snap your fingers, this thing turned its head, looked right at me. It stared at me for about a second or two, very curious expression on its face, before jumping 20 feet in the air into the tree line and disappeared. My jaw about dropped to the ground. In that moment, my pants became 20 pounds heavier, and I should have brought a new pair of jeans with me. That, my friends, was a tough pill to swallow. I had seen a real living animal that resembled that of a werewolf. What are the odds of that happening just a couple of weeks after I saw a werewolf movie? I packed my things up and I left in fear that this thing would return, possibly with more of them. I kept trying to tell myself, no, this isn't possible. These things don't exist. I was just seeing things and I was just having a joke played on me. No man in a werewolf costume, I don't care how big or small, can jump 20 feet up in the air and into the trees like this thing did, at the speed that it did. It was completely unnatural. I don't know if dogmen or werewolves truly exist, but I do know for sure that there are unknown animals out there living among us. When I was a little boy, my father acquired a rather large property from an older gentleman who used to trophy hunt a lot in his younger days. Along with the property, he was giving my father all of his prized trophies that came with it, because he was getting older, much older, and got tired of lugging them all around with him, and really wanted to start minimalizing his living. He just wanted to find the right tenant who would appreciate all of his years of love and labor. As a little boy, I do remember all of the trophies. Everything from large exotic bison, bucks, African exotic animals, alligators, I can go on and on. Things that would make you squirm. Then, he had a whole room dedicated to skulls that he had found during his time hunting. The one that I wanted to talk to you about was this colossal-sized canine skull that had far oversized canines. The other unorthodox part of the skull is that all the teeth, besides the canines, were like needle pins, razor sharp, and even with the aging and wear and tear of the skull, they were still very much intact and sharp as ever. The skull was larger than a cow skull, and my dad, nor the older gentleman who sold him the place, really knew where it came from. He had forgotten the location that he found it in, but thinks it was up in the Rocky Mountains, if he remembered correctly. Growing up, I always thought it could have been a dire wolf skull, but the teeth never made sense to me. Isn't a dire wolf just a larger version of a wolf? I don't think they had exaggerated canines or razor-bladed teeth. This thing didn't even have molars, just razor teeth. It was not until my later 20s that I got into cryptozoology that I started to realize that maybe that the skull was from something much more. Well, my father sold everything in that house and then sold the property a while back, so we lost all ownership of everything that was there. To this very day, I kick myself for not taking that skull, but it surely was incredible. I might just be overplaying it here, and hyping up the issue when there's nothing really there. I can't guarantee that this was a dogman skull, but in my heart of hearts, that's what I want to believe. It doesn't match up with any other known canine skull that I've ever seen, and the size alone was abnormally large. I believe these creatures are really out there, but I've never seen one. Maybe whoever acquired that skull and the property has a potential connection and one foot in the door to actually proving these things do exist. There might still be DNA on that thing, and maybe, just maybe, I could track down whoever bought the property. I've already submitted my encounter to several other big YouTubers like Swamp Dweller, Darkness Prevails, and that's just to name a couple, and I wanted to share it with you. I'm almost certain that there is a dogman, or a small pack of dogmen, living out by where I live. There is a large field that is empty along the main road that I drive to leave this area. It's probably about 15 acres of just large field with no development on it, filled to the brim with tall grass and even a small pond. I believe it's full of rabbits. We see them all over the place. Every spring and summer, they are everywhere. They're constantly dead on the side of the road, and I'm always seeing them hopping around. That's not counting all the other little animals we have, like possums, skunks, raccoons, all your typical little American animals that live out here in the boonies. I truly believe that I have seen several of these dogman creatures. I've had several sightings, and it's usually all in the early morning or evening time when it's dusky outside. They resemble very closely a German shepherd with very pointy ears, walking around on two legs. I've never seen them running, only walking, but they are out visible in the field without a care in the world to whoever drives by and sees them. I know the road that it's close to isn't necessarily a busy road, but people still go up and down it. I'm sure I'm not the only person to have witnessed what I have, and I firmly believe that they are dogmen. The only time I've ever seen more than one was in the early morning a few weeks back when I saw a really tall one, and then a smaller one next to it following after. They're always headed in the opposite direction that I'm in, or they seem like they're headed back into the woods. I don't know if they are here seasonally or if they're here for food, because I know with all the rabbits around, there is plenty to eat. There's almost like an infestation of rabbits. I've never gone adventuring into that empty, undeveloped land, so I don't know how many hollows and little dens there are full of rabbits, but I'm sure it's plentiful if there's that many dogmen around. From what I know, the woods surrounding that undeveloped plot of land are state game land or state-owned, and it goes on for miles and miles, up against several of the rolling hills and mountains behind us. I'm not sure if anybody really lives back there, or there's really any other property development, but to my knowledge, there is not. This would equip a dogman with plenty of places to hide and thrive, without ever being discovered by a human. A little too close to home if you ask me, but I've never seen or had any issues with them around my house. Now that I think about it, I'm honestly surprised because I have quite a few cherry trees, apple trees, apricot trees, and even pear trees, and I know they are generally attracted to those things, or maybe just attracted to what kind of prey those things bring. You wouldn't even begin to believe the high amounts of deer and other animals those trees pull in, and that means my property is probably just a ticking time bomb to be pulling these creatures in. I fear that once the rabbits and other small animals have been eaten up, these creatures will move on. I only live right up the road, a couple of miles, which is practically a stone's throw away for these things. I do feel fortunate that I am very well versed and knowledgeable about cryptids and dogman, especially that I feel equipped to deal with the situation if it ever does arise. I have plenty of firepower, and I could even put bars on my windows if needed. I've heard too many horror stories of people dealing with these things who don't expect it, and I refuse to be a statistic who is found dead, or my body is missing, and only blood to be found. I will fight to the death if I have to, but for now, I'm just going to keep my distance and respect that they are here, in hopes they will never find me and leave me alone.